Great. We are now recording and we're going to begin. Again, glad that everyone has joined us this evening. We have, looks like a whole bunch of you here, 18 participants, including myself. So we are going to begin tonight by talking about the idea of Jews being the people of the book. That was a name that was given to us, but it still rings true. One of the things that you'll notice when you come into our holiest space, into a sanctuary, our worship space, what do we have at the center of it? A book, right? The book is the centerpiece of our ritual, the Torah, and the Torah is can be a very specific thing, but can also be a very expansive thing. Torah, if we're talking about just that book in the sanctuary, Torah is the first five books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and it is so it's made up of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, in Hebrew, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim, and that is the I guess the smallest Torah concept of Torah. Torah is also very expansive. The rabbis have this notion of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the written Torah, that which is written down, meaning the Torah that I just described, maybe even as expansive as the Bible itself. And then Torah Shebichtav, the oral Torah, the traditions that were passed down orally, and then finally written down. That's the irony of the oral Torah, is that it was eventually written down because it got to be so big that they had to have a way of looking at it and reading it and referencing it. And Torah can be even larger than that. Torah writ large can mean, the word itself means learning. And so it can mean any kind of Jewish learning. And it's very, very expansive in that anything that I read, learn, teach, anything that any Jewish scholar, any rabbi reads, learns, teach, that can be Torah. So and we see this even in the Bible itself, because in the book of Leviticus, it says, this is the Torah of this particular offering. This is the Torah of this particular offering. So Torah can be a teaching of a small different thing, or Torah can be any kind of Jewish learning whatsoever. So I want to share one thing first, and then we'll let me get my screen sharing. Here it is. Share. So we're all looking at a chart that I have called Books of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And when we talk about the Torah specifically, we're talking about the first section of the Tanakh, the Torah, the 5 books that I mentioned here. Now, we call it the Tanakh as an acronym, the 3 parts of the Bible. T in Tanakh, the letter Tav is for Torah. The N in Tanakh is Nun, Nevi'im, the second part of the Bible. The prophets, the former prophets that are earlier, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the latter prophets. We have these 3 long books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. The 12 minor prophets, they're minor not because they're not important, but because their books are small. And sometimes they're called the Treasar, the 12, because their books are small, and it was that they were all bound together in one scroll, which is why they're the 12 minor. Then you have Ketuvim, the writing. So we have Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, Ketuvim, the writing. So that's where Tanakh comes from. But the writings are poetic and wisdom books, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, the 5 scrolls that we read on holidays, right? Song of Songs on Passover, Ruth on Shavuot, Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, Ecclesiastes we just read last week on Sukkot, Esther we read on Purim, and the others later books, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, or Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The last 2 of these are history books. There's always multiple answers to every question in Judaism, and even how many books are in the Bible. So you would think with a number, with a question as easy as how many books are in the Bible, you'd have one answer, but no. How many books are in the Bible? Either 24 or 39. So how do we get 24 and 39? Well, 24 is as you'll see in biblical canon, 12 is a very important number. 12 appears all through the Bible, and so to have something be a multiple of 12 is really cool. And so the Bible can be reckoned to having 24 books. The 5 here, and I see I've got the number 24 here. So we've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. But we could also have 39 books because 1st and 2nd Samuel can be each their own book. Same can 1st and 2nd Kings. And the 12 minor prophets, each of them are their own book. And Ezra and Nehemiah are each their own book, and so are 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So if you separate all these out, you get 39. So how many books are in the Bible? 24 or 39, depending on how you count them. So a brief overview that Genesis begins with creation. We actually begin the book of Genesis this week. We just finished our Torah reading cycle of the year with Simchat Torah. We concluded Deuteronomy. We began with Genesis, and we read this Shabbat coming up is Genesis. We Breshit, the first Torah portion. And this is the origins, the creation of the world and humanity, the covenant that the story of with Adam and Eve, and with Noah, and following into to Abraham and the covenant that God has with Abraham and Abraham's family, and with the generations of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and his entire family. Exodus begins with Israel in Egypt, the people of Israel collectively in Egypt, and it's called Exodus because they leave, they exit from Exodus from Egypt, and concludes continues with the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and concludes with a very long description of the Mishkan, the building of God's sacred space within the Israelite community as they're wandering through the wilderness. Leviticus is a book all about priestly and matters, and a book of holiness. Numbers is called Numbers because of there's 2 census that are taken, and it tells of the trials and tribulations of the people of Israel wandering through the wilderness. And Deuteronomy, much of Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell speeches to Israel as they were about to enter the promised land. We get to the prophets, and we have somewhat of a chronological telling here. Joshua and Judges, the Israelites enter the promised land and have struggles with the people of the land. 1st and 2nd Samuel is the story of the rise of the monarchy and King David and his life. Samuel is my favorite book of the Bible, and David is my absolute favorite character in the biblical story. The most important person in the Bible. We think of Moses being important, and he certainly is, but to the Torah itself. But I think David is the most important person in the Bible writ large. 1st and 2nd Kings tells the narratives of the kings of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, Judah in the south, Israel in the north, how they split apart, and their history, mostly a religious history about how they about their relationship with God, and whether the kings of these countries, of these kingdoms, how they interact with God, how they are loyal to God's covenant and the worship in Jerusalem. The prophets are are scattered about within the history of Israel. They are somewhat chronological. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are chronological in that order. Isaiah lives during the time of the book of 2nd Kings, about 100 years before the kingdom of Jerusalem is destroyed. The kingdom of Judah is destroyed. Jeremiah lives and sees the destruction of the temple of the last 50 years of the Judean kingdom, prophecies about destruction and hope. One word about Isaiah, we'll go back for a second. Isaiah is a prophet who his book is divided up into multiple parts, and many scholars think that, and I think they're right, that it's actually several different, at least two, maybe three different books. The first 40 chapters come from the time of King Hezekiah. Later chapters come from a later time when Israel has already been destroyed, and lots of messages of hope and reconciliation. Ezekiel prophecies to the people who are exiled in Babylon, because he lives there. He lives in Babylon. He's speaking from Babylon. And the 12 minor prophets are scattered all throughout this history. Hosea and Amos, actually, and Joel come from even before the prophet Isaiah. And in the Ketuvim, and actually, before we get there, some of the 12 minor prophets exist and thrive after even the book of Ezekiel. So Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are prophets who live after the destruction of the temple, and actually during the return to Judah by the exiles some 70 years later. You have a prophet like Jonah, where Jonah is a prophet, but he's not really a prophet. His book reads much more like one of the five scrolls, and his book is read on the holiday of Yom Kippur. And so that's an interesting story unto itself, about and he prophesies to non-Israelites, to the Assyrians. And then we have the Ketuvim, the Psalms, which are poetry. They're ancient liturgy. We have Proverbs, which are Proverbs, a book of wisdom. Job is a fascinating book about one man's struggle with reward and punishment and sin, and questions the meaning of life. Really, it's a really powerful book. Each of these scrolls are really very, the five scrolls, beautiful literature. Esther is obviously the most famous of these. And then Daniel it's a very interesting book. Daniel is full of visions and dreams, and the story of a prophet living in exile. While Ezra and Nehemiah are before First and Second Chronicles in order, First and Second Chronicles is actually a history of the Judean kingdom, ending with Cyrus, the king of Persia, allowing the Israelites to return. And Ezra and Nehemiah are stories about the return of the exiles, rebuilding Jerusalem. So that's the structure of the Bible itself. Any questions right there after that quick and dirty summation of the arc of the Bible? So the Bible itself, I would call it an anthology. Some people say, well, the Bible says. Well, here's the problem with saying the Bible says. The Bible is written over 1,000 years, from about the year 1200 or 1300 BCE till about the year 200 BCE. So it's 1,000 years span from the earliest to the latest material. And it comes from all different perspectives, from all different authors, from all different places and all different times. So there are things that are contradictory in the Bible, and so it's an anthology. It's an anthology of the Jewish peoples, or I'll come to that term in a second. It's an anthology of our ancient ancestors in their relationship with God, and in their struggle to discover God and to respond to the divine call, and to respond to and to understand their relationship with God through story, through law, through poetry, through prophecy, through narrative, and so the Bible is not one monolithic thing. It is an anthology that took place over 1,000 years of composition, and so it's an ever evolving thing, and so we have the full gamut. It's kind of like saying taking a piece of literature today and saying everything from Beowulf to Shakespeare to Stephen King represents English literature. English, like what? That you can't say like that's one thing. The Bible is a compilation of the Israelite um, uh, search and struggle and reckoning with their own history, with their relationship with God, in all sorts of modalities. And so it's a really rich text because it's so multivocal. Because it comes from all different genres. And even within one book itself, it can do that. So I want to go back to this. I want to share one more thing. Let's do this. Okay. I'm going to share this document here, a brief chronology of Jewish history. We'll be coming back to this. So if you look at the biblical period, the ancestors of the Jews migrate from Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan, but that's the call of Abraham. That's and this, the nomadic and early settlement of the patriarchs and tribal lineages. This is Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. These are nomads. They are pastoral nomads, and they have flocks and herds and sheep. And one thing that is common to people say about Abraham is he was the first Jew. That's actually not true. He, I would say, is the first to have a covenant with God, with the God whom we spell whose name we spell Yud He Vav He, but is unpronounceable to us. To say that Abraham was a Jew is anachronistic because the idea of being a Jew doesn't come around for another several hundred years, maybe 1,000 years, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. But Abraham isn't even an Israelite because the name Israelite comes from Israel, Jacob, his grandson. We'll get to that in a minute. So this first period covers the book of Genesis, kind of, sort of, and the book of Genesis ends with, as I mentioned before, the family of Jacob, the entire family of Jacob, who he has 2 wives, 2 concubines, and as far as we can tell, 12 sons and 1 daughter, but there might be more. The Bible alludes to the fact there may be more. And then we have the Exodus from Egypt. When did that happen? We're not really sure, but we can probably say around 1250, before the Common Era. That's what this BCE means. And there's another big question, did the Exodus happen? Is any of this stuff historical? Difficult question to answer. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I would call the book of Genesis semi-myth, semi-mythology. Did it happen historically? I don't know. We don't know. We'll never know. Did the Exodus from Egypt happen? Probably. And I can say that because most of the people, most of the leaders of Israel have Egyptian names, like Moses is an Egyptian name. Aaron is an Egyptian name. Phineas is an Egyptian name. Many of the Levites have Egyptian names. The temple, the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, is in the form of an Egyptian kind of royal building. So there's Egyptian influence certainly there. So the first mention of Israel outside the Bible is in a stone structure called a stela, written by the pharaoh Merneptah, who lived around the year 1200 before the Common Era, and he says that Israel has been destroyed. Kind of ironic. The first time we hear about Israel, they're destroyed, and it's just as they're emerging from Exodus from Egypt into their land. But anyway, let's get back to this. So the Exodus from Egypt, the conquest and settlement of Canaan, development of tribal structures. Right. This is the tribes, the book of Judges. And then we have the monarchy, the period of 1050 to 586 BCE, where we have the rise and establishment of the Davidic monarchy, the first temple built by Solomon, the split between the 2 kingdoms, the north and the south, and the Bible has nothing good to say about the northern kingdom, because the northern kingdom, the book of Kings was written in the Jerusalem is written in the city of Judah, favoring certainly the Jerusalem temple. And they're, of course, going to say terrible things about the north because they don't come down to the south to worship at the Jerusalem temple. They have their own holy sites. So there's lots of negative things said about the northern kingdom, even when the northern kingdom is much stronger and much more powerful, because the northern kingdom is in a has crossroads of major highways and has much better fertile land. The northern kingdom becomes an economic powerhouse, and the southern kingdom is kind of like a backwater place. But we don't get that from the Bible, because the Bible hates the northern kingdom and loves the southern kingdom because it's the continuous line of David. The northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians in 722, and this is where we get the idea of the 10 lost tribes, because the northern kingdom was composed of the 10 tribes, and that was destroyed. And then Jerusalem is destroyed about 150 years later by the Babylonians, who conquer the Assyrians. What we have here afterwards, Babylonia is conquered by the Persians in the 540s, and in 539 there's the beginning of the return to Zion by Cyrus of Persia. And Cyrus is a very interesting guy. What's fascinating about Cyrus, so previous kingdoms were all about conquering and destruction. The Assyrians were the first evil empire. They did really terrible things to the people they conquered. They scattered them, they exiled them. Same thing with the Babylonians. The Persians had a different attitude. The Persians said, you know what, we want our people to be happy, so we're going to let them return to their land to settle, and they'll be provinces of the Persian Empire. And it worked pretty well. And so Cyrus says, here, go back, return, build your temple, and do good things. What's interesting is that very few people actually returned. There was a community of Jews that lived in Babylon. We don't really hear from them again for 1,000 years, until about 500 years later with the Talmud, till the 500 year of the Common Era with the Talmud. So we have a very successful, flourishing Babylonian community, which we don't know about because they've left very little archaeological evidence or books for us to see until the Talmud emerges 1,000 years later. But back in Judah, in Judea, there's the return to Zion, and the idea, and most Jews, as I said, didn't want to return, and the ones that did return also found everything in disrepair and other people living there, and so there's a long struggle to rebuild. They eventually do. I'm skipping a lot of interesting details which we could go into in a minute, but I want to talk about something really crucial here, because there's an evolution at this point in nomenclature and identity. So the oldest term that we identify with is that identifies our people is Israel, or Israelites, or B'nai Israel, the children of Israel. The term B'nai Israel, children of Israel, is ancient. It goes back to Jacob. Jacob. His name is changed by God to Israel, and his descendants are B'nai Israel, the children of Israel. And the Bible uses Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and Goy, which is a nation, people, nation. These are all terms of peoplehood, of nationhood, of collective belonging. And so, which is how you and when the kingdom of Israel, when the United Kingdom of Israel splits, it becomes Israel in the north and Judah in the south, because Judah is the primary tribe. It's just Judah and Benjamin there, and some Levites scattered around. And what's important to know here is that these are all Israelites. They just live geographically in two different places. And it's not just nomenclature, but it's also lifestyle and worship. Israelites worship in the temple through sacrifice. And it's also, I think it would be fair to say that Israelites acknowledge the existence of other gods. It's very clear in the Bible that the Israelites at the very least acknowledge and sometimes worship other gods. How do we know? Because the Bible tells us over and over that they do, and that they shouldn't be doing it, right? Let's think with our sociological caps on. If the Bible tells us don't do this, it means that people are actually doing it. Very famous, well-known line in our liturgy comes from Exodus chapter 15. Micha mocha ba'elim Adonai. Who is like you among the other gods? Yud Hey Vav Hey. That statement implies that there are other gods and that Israel acknowledges them. They shouldn't worship them, but they acknowledge, but there's an acknowledgement that they exist. That's and so there's the and the encouragement is to worship the one God through sacrificial rites. But something changes radically, especially when you get to after the destruction of the temple. After 586 BC, two things happen. One is that the kingdom of Judah, first off, after the northern kingdom is destroyed, there's only the kingdom of Judah. And so everyone left are Judahites, or for short, Jews. So Jew is a shortened form of the acknowledgement of a Judahite, the people from the land of Judah, the people from Judea. And so there's a change in geographical terms, in nomenclature, but also in essence, in theology. Jews, I would say, Jews only acknowledge and worship one God. And if we see the latter prophets, especially latter portions of Isaiah, it's not just that there is that you should worship Yud Hey Vav Hey alone. It's that there is only Yud Hey Vav Hey, and all the other gods are meaningless and worthless and don't exist, and the people who worship them are just kidding themselves. So there's a fundamental change between Israelite and Jew. Israelite worships, when is encouraged to worship the single God whom Abraham made covenant with, but also maybe acknowledges the existence of other gods. Jew worships only one God, is descendant of the people of the tribe of Judah, and acknowledges only one God. And that's a fundamental change with the return to Zion. And after when the Persians let them return. And this becomes even more important. If you look down here where it says emergence of classical Judaism centered around the law and its interpretation, this is the beginning of the oral law, where the Torah itself becomes canonized, and later prophets become canonized. When I say canonized, I mean like the books are these are the important books. These are the important books that we need to know and are acknowledging as our holy books. And since they're our books, we read them over and over again, and we acknowledge them and we interpret them. And what happens in the world at large is that the Greeks rise to power, the Persians fall to Alexander the Great's empire. His empire is destroyed, or falls apart, I should say, and is divided into different sectors, one of which is based in Egypt, a Greek empire based in Egypt, and a Greek empire based in Syria. And the Jews are located between these, are jockeying back and forth. And this leads to, famously, the Maccabean revolt, the story of Hanukkah, because Antiochus or Antiochus IV outlaws Judaism. And it's a struggle. The Maccabean revolt is a revolt of Jewish extremists versus Greek Jewish extremists, meaning Jews that want to Hellenize and get rid of Jewish practice, and Maccabees that want to retain they're called Maccabees because they rally around Judah Maccabee, because they want to retain Jewish tradition and the laws of their people, and it's an intra-Jewish struggle. The Maccabees wind up winning over the silent majority, as it were, and retake the temple in 165. But the important part about and to this is where the miracle of the story of Hanukkah comes. The miracle of oil comes later. We can talk about that at a time. But the really crucial thing about the revolt of the Maccabees is that they go to war for an idea. And it's not only self-preservation and defense against their own territory, because really, like, they've been living under other people's rule for a couple hundred years at this point. They go to when they win, they wind up winning their own land and establishing the Second Jewish Commonwealth. But they go to war for an idea, the idea of one God. And that's a revolutionary thing. They go to battle because they want to preserve one God. I think Christopher Hitchens, a famous rabidly atheist author, died a few years ago. He wrote that he hated Hanukkah because of its particularity and if there would be no Hanukkah, then there'd be no Christianity. And he hates the Maccabees for that. And all the more so, I would say, yes, you're exactly right, but for the wrong reasons. Like the Maccabees, because they went to war for an idea of monotheism, because they saved Judaism, and because they saved Judaism, it gave rise to all monotheistic faiths. So it's a crucial event in the history of the world, really. And with and what's interesting is this is why I think that Judaism has changed so much, because the first temple was destroyed because of worship of other gods, right? And the Bible gives the theology that God says, you worship other gods, I'm going to punish you. But here, and the Maccabean revolt, they revolt for the purpose of worshiping one God. So everything's just so fundamentally changed. But even as there is a temple, there is a diffusion of Jewish ideas, right? Different religious groups within Eretz Yisrael, within the land of Israel. If you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They are beginning around this time. You have a Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt, where Philo combines Jewish culture with Hellenistic thought. You have the emergence of the Pharisees, who are like the spiritual antecedents of the rabbis, who talk about oral law and give the ideals of scholarship and piety and prayer and study, and the rise of Rome, who the Hasmoneans, they were the Hasmonean kingdom was established after the Maccabean revolt, but they were really terrible rulers, really petty, so bad that the Romans had to come in and kind of clean house. And install. If you ever heard of King Herod, he was a king that was installed by the Romans. Beautiful architecture. He was a master builder, but he was a terrible, terrible guy, really bad guy, who basically was super paranoid and he killed anybody he thought was trying to get him, including his own family members. He also pretty much wiped out he married into the Hasmonean Maccabean family, and he wiped them all out because he thought they were trying to get him. Messed up guy. This is also the time, it's also a very crucial time in the history of Israel. The first century of the Common Era, first century before the Common Era, it's because the Romans didn't know what to do with the Jews. The Romans were very for the most part, harsh leaders, especially when they took direct control. And you have lots of groups who saw how bad times were and thought to themselves that times were so bad that the Messianic era was upon us, that someone would rise and overthrow Roman rule and lead us to victory and independence again. You had lots of these people, lots of these messiahs, and Messiah just means anointed one, leader. Every ancient leader in Israel in the first temple period were messiahs in the sense that they were anointed by oil. But you had and the revolt against Rome in the year 66 of the Common Era to 70. there were different messiahs all over the place, people who said they were messiahs, and this is where you also get the beginnings of Christianity, the movement around Jesus as a Messiah. A nice Jewish boy born in Bethlehem named Yeshua, who had his own teachings, and that was taken in another direction, but we're not going in that direction, so we're talking about Judaism here. So it's a really formative and time of crisis, the first century, where you have temple worship, but it's very corrupt. They're puppets of the Romans. Where you have a diffusion of Judaism in where you have classes of sages and rabbinical schools of study and interpretation, and so this is where right, you have the fall of the Second Temple, which was a catastrophic event, because when the Babylonians, when they destroyed the first temple, they exiled Judeans to Babylon, and they left people there, and the Babylonians the Judeans who were in Babylonia, they thrived and established their own community, and the Babylonians really didn't care what happened to Judea. The thing with the Romans, however, is that the Jews were like one of the only groups to successfully revolt against the Romans, and they did it twice. And when you revolt against the Romans, they really don't like that. And the Romans, when they came in, they destroyed everything. They destroyed the temple. They burned Jerusalem to the ground. They exiled tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people all across the Roman Empire, which begins the Jewish diaspora in Europe and North Africa. But really, it's a lot of this was started by these messiahs who were very extremist and took control of the revolt against Rome. The rabbis, when they say, so the rabbis say, why was the first temple destroyed? The first temple was destroyed because we didn't worship God. The second temple, they say, was destroyed by sinat chinam, by baseless hatred, meaning, and they have legendary material about what this means. But the idea of baseless hatred, the sinat chinam, is the rabbis framing, it's their way to frame the sectarian infighting among the Jews. There were all these different groups, even within Jerusalem, as it was being besieged by the Romans, that they couldn't get along. Now, look, could the Jews, even if they were united, hold off the Romans? Probably not. But it might not have been as devastating as it was. And in fact, we are given a legend. Was it true? We're not sure how accurate this legend is, but it's a very famous legend of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who basically, he wants to get out of Jerusalem, but the extremists won't let him out. So he has a group of his students put him in a casket, and they try to carry him out of the city, and they kind of smuggle him out, and they have to lie to the Jewish guards, and they get him out of Jerusalem, and they bring him to Vespasian, who's the Roman general. And as the legend goes, Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I know you're going to be emperor because only a king can destroy Jerusalem. And Vespasian's like, okay, fine. You'll just sit in prison for a while. And Vespasian then is declared emperor of Rome, and comes back to Yochanan ben Zakkai and says, hey, you're right. So I'm going to give you a gift. What do you want? Anything. And Yochanan ben Zakkai says, give me Yavna and give me my rabbinic sages, and we'll go to Yavna. We'll leave you alone. Do your thing. We just want to do our thing. And Vespasian says, okay, great. And so this story of leads to the beginning of the flourishing of the rabbis. and as you see here, there's a conference of canonization on the biblical literature, the real beginning of the rabbinic period, even though it was in development before that. And even later, there's the fall of the Romans are ruling, and yet there is a messianic fervor among the Jews. Why? Because remember that first temple that was destroyed? Well, about 70 years later, we got to go back. And so they're thinking, hey, the temple was destroyed and it's almost 70 years after, and maybe we're going to overthrow the Romans and get our temple back. And this coalesces around a guy named Bar Kokhba. His name is Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star, a very messianic name. The rabbis also give him the nickname Bar Koziba, which means son of a lie, because he failed. And the Bar Kokhba revolt was in 135 to 138 of the Common Era, and this was under Hadrian, the Roman emperor, and this was really bad. Like, there was terrible massacres of the Jews, and basically all organized Jewish life in and around Jerusalem was ended by the Romans. It's they while the temple was a ruin after this, the Romans built a pagan temple there. There's a myth that they salted the lands of Judah so that they couldn't plant there for generations afterwards. And the fall of Beitar, that's the last holdout, and this is a real tragic thing. There's a rabbinic legend of the 10 martyrs, who very famous rabbis who were tortured and killed by the Romans in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Very graphic, ugly stuff that comes up in later Jewish liturgy when remembering martyrs. But even as this is happening, the rabbis are developing they have the biblical canon. They have these books that are considered holy, that through which God speaks to them, and the idea of the divine word in Jewish tradition is that because it's divine, there is mystery behind it. Because it's divine, there must be more to it than what it actually says. Because nothing that's divine could be simple and plain. And we have to search, and we have to understand, and we have to figure out what it all means. And this is where the investment of learning comes into play, that the Torah, the written Torah, becomes the oral Torah and something writ large. And you have the oral tradition happening here. So Rabbi Judah the Prince, who flourishes around the year 200, compiles the Mishnah. It's a written digest of oral traditions and the rules of what's called the Tanaim, the teachers. And the Mishnah, again, is codified, is written down. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the oral Torah is written down. The Mishnah is a series of pithy legal statements that tries to recreate an ideal world. And it has every subject you could possibly imagine. And the Mishnah is broken down to 6 orders. 6 orders, which are basically agricultural law. There's festivals. There's issues of men and women. There are issues of civil and criminal law, purity law, and holy matters. And it's interesting that the rabbis invest so much time in purity law and holy matters, which are just realms of the temple. They're living 150 years after the temple, and they're investing so much time discussing matters of an eventual return to the temple. And so these 6 orders of the Mishnah so the Mishnah is then taken and it's interpreted, because part of it stays in the land of Israel and part of it's taken to Babylonia, where, remember how hundreds of years before, almost 1,000 years before, we had a Jewish community there. Well, now they have suddenly emerged in the year 500, interpreting the Mishnah into the Gemara, or the Talmud. So I have this note here: established from the Babylonian rabbinical academies and the development of vast commentaries in the Mishnah called Talmud by Amoraim. Consolidations of these comments and other traditions produced Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds, mid 5th and 6th centuries. And you also have Midrashic, which is non-legal creative material. And so what the Talmud is So the Talmud is it's like nothing you've ever studied before. The Talmud is the next layer of the oral tradition. So if the Mishnah are these pithy statements, the Talmud is the legal discussions on it. And it's, so-and-so says this and so says this. That's the Mishnah. But then the Talmud says, well, did he really say that? Maybe he meant this, but this applies this way to us and this applies this way to us. And the Talmud is an ongoing argument. It rarely resolves. It's just it's a good Jewish book. It's the pinnacle of Jewish books because it hardly ever resolves itself and always provides multiple explanations for certain for most things. What's interesting is the Talmud. It doesn't interpret all of the Mishnah, specifically the parts about the holy things and purity issues, because they're living in a time when, hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple, where this stuff doesn't apply. What I like to say quite often is that if you want to learn about Judaism, don't read the Bible, read the Talmud. The Bible does not talk about the Judaism that we have. We live Rabbinic Judaism. We live Talmud Judaism, both in practice and in methodology, meaning that all the traditions that we have, all the way with this, that we celebrate holidays and live our lives, are Talmudic, not rabbinic, or sorry, rabbinic and not biblical. Meaning, for Rosh Hashanah, for example, all the Torah says to do is sound a horn on the first day of the 7th month. What does that mean? Well, the rabbis tell us all sorts of things we're supposed to do. We sound a shofar. What's a shofar like? What are the sounds of the shofar? When does the holiday fall? Why does the holiday fall this way? So, and same thing with every single experience that we have. What's Hanukkah? How do we celebrate Hanukkah? What's a Sukkah? How do we celebrate Sukkot? What's Shabbat? How do we celebrate Shabbat? All the story. Then we have the idea of midrash. One of the fundamental, most famous stories about Abraham is how when he was a youth, he smashed. His father was an idol maker, and he smashed his father's idols. Well, that story appears nowhere in the Bible. That's a classic midrash. It's quite ancient. But it's a midrash. It's a legendary. It's Jewish legend that does not appear at all in the Bible, but it fleshes out the stories and gives it flourish, so we better understand who Abraham was as a person and why Abraham was chosen to be in covenant with God. I'm going to stop there for just a minute, get a drink of water. And I'm wondering if anybody has any questions. If you do, please raise your hand on mute. Please feel free to share or ask. No questions. Okay, that's fine. I know I just throw a lot of stuff at you. Another thing that I wanted to show you, where is it? Here it is. Let me share my screen. I'm sharing the screen here, which is the evolution of Jewish literature. Yeah, there's a question here. Yeah, I'll stop that for a second. And let's see. Yeah, you can unmute yourself and ask away.
There we go. The Talmud is a very difficult read. I started this last session. We've gone through over 1,000 days now, and it gets into some things that really are disgusting. Talking, for example, about when a child is 3.5 years old, she's okay to be married, and things like that. But I'm finding sometimes I'm trying to figure out how it agrees with the Torah? You know, where does it come from?
So it's a good question. So the Talmud covers, everything and every subject you could possibly imagine. And yes, some of the things in the Talmud are quite disturbing. Look, the ancient world was a disturbing place. And it was a much more violent place, a place which had it's like an alien planet, really. I mean, there's a whole section in the book of in the section Masechet Brachot, in the section about blessings and prayer. It's like, what if you come across a pile of excrement on the ground? Are you allowed to recite prayers when you're standing next to a pile of excrement? Well, what does that tell us? That tells us that people encountered excrement on the ground all the time. Right. So it's just a different world that they're living in. It's also the case where because the Talmud is it's a conversation, it's an ongoing conversation, and conflict drives the conversation. Disagreement has to drive the conversation. What the rabbis are looking for are the edge examples. Right. So what's the situation? How far does this particular law apply? How far, in what context? Because they wouldn't talk about something if everybody agreed about it, right? Because everybody agrees about it. So they're, when it's talking about and I've been studying doing the Daf Yomi and studying the Talmud page a day for the past 2.5, almost 3 years at this point, where it's talking about, recently, we're in the part where it's talking about it's called Nashim. It's on women. So it's Talmud's written by men. It's discussed by men. So they're discussing women because women are the other, and they have to figure out how to live in the world with women and all the weird things that women's bodies do, again from men's perspective, and also how to things like marriage and divorce and contracts with marriage and divorce, all that stuff. So what they're doing is talk about the edge issues, because the edge issues can teach you about the central issues. And the edge issues are where the conversations happen. So yes, there's some disturbing things in the Talmud, without a doubt. I mean, some days I'm reading the Talmud, I'm like, that's icky. Or not icky, it's like, that's offensive and repulsive. But it's the ancient world, it's a different world. It's a different, completely different milieu than we live in. But the forms of the Talmud the forms are formative in how rabbinic Judaism exists. But it's also difficult because of the way the Talmud is written. So I remember specifically from my first year of rabbinical school, first trying to read Talmud and understand Talmud. And we come in after to the class of the teacher after trying to read our earliest exposure to Talmud, and we're clueless. We don't know what's going on. We don't know, because it's not the way we Westerners are trained to think. We Westerners are trained to think in the Platonic, Socratic, and an Aristotelian method of scientific, explanation and hypothesis, test hypothesis, and all that. That's not the Talmud. The Talmud is a back and forth conversation of challenge and answer, and then challenge and answer again. And it's a different modality of thinking than we have. And that's why Talmud can be very challenging for people who are not used to that to encounter. Mark, yes, you can unmute yourself.
So I had not read the Talmud, and just kind of talking or listening to your interpretation of it it sounds like it's a series. You take an issue, and it's a series of arguments in one way or the other on what to think of the issue. But it also sounds like there's no finality. So if I'm reading it, do I interpret it like, let's say there's a back and forth and it doesn't sound like there's an agreement. Do I interpret it as what I agree with and how to follow it? Is that how that works?
Great question. Very great question. So kind of, sort of, but not really.
Okay.
That's a Jewish answer for you, right? So what I mean by that is that, right? So at the end of the day, right? How do I cook this chicken, right? Or how does the shofar supposed to sound, or how do I put on tefillin, right? It's nice when you can go back and have, right? But so Jewish tradition has always had this expansive and contracting understanding of Jewish law, which actually I was going to get to that chart that I was going to bring out, because at the end of the day, you need a legal code to figure out what to do. So let me bring this chart up again, and because that'll answer your question, I think. Here we go. Right. So what we have here is, if you look at the top right, the written Torah, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We have the prophets and the writings. Then we have halacha, which is the legal material, and agadah, which is legend, which is stories and narrative and interpretation. And then we have the Mishnah, the 6 orders, and we have the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. And there are other ways, and then there's agadah goes into it, halacha goes into it, but it's this back and forth. The problem is, what you're saying is like, how do I cook this chicken, right? So what this is called piskei halacha, which means the interpreters, or the decisors of Jewish law, of Jewish practice, and we'll talk about the term halacha much more in depth later on. But what you have is a need to write this stuff down in a usable code. And so you have these commentators that do this. Is Maimonides, the Mishnah Torah. Maimonides, what he wanted to do is he wanted to take all of rabbinic law and put it down into one legal code that you could very easily follow. And he did it. He called it the Mishnah Torah, kind of arrogantly. Mishnah Torah means second Torah. And he's like, all you need is the Torah and me, my Mishnah Torah, my second. That's all you need. And so he wrote a legal code about the 12th century. We'll talk more about that next week, about his milieu. But the 10th, 11th, 12th century, he wrote down a legal code so that you know how to do every single thing. But nobody followed it, because Maimonides is really complicated, and he wrote it in 14 different sections. Like, who wants 14 different sections, right? The Mishnah was, the Talmud are 6 sections. Like, he made it more complicated. So a couple of hundred years later, you have the Arba Turim, the 4 columns, 4 sections. Okay, 4 sections is good. I can deal with 4 sections. And then the 4 sections descended into the Shulchan Aruch, which is called the Set Table. And the Shulchan Aruch is the authoritative legal code. It was written, if you look at this note, it's the most authoritative code of Jewish law. Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote a monumental commentary on the Torah, and then extracted from his commentary what he deemed to be the law based on the opinions of the Rif, the Rambam, and the Torah. The Shulchan Aruch is published with the glosses of Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who carefully went through Karo's text and added in comments indicating when and how Ashkenazi communities differed in their practice from Karo had written. So the Shulchan Aruch is the authoritative text for Jewish communities, for observant communities today. And people still use the Shulchan Aruch. It was written by Joseph Caro in Sfat, in the land of Israel, in the 1600s, and the glosses were are added by a rabbi from Poland about 150, 100 years later. And what's interesting is that even when anybody writes a law code, there are always glosses, meaning like, this is how we do Judaism. This is the right way. And then somebody comes and says, wait a second, we don't do it that way. We do it this way. And they write glosses on the codes. And then somebody says, wait a second, I'm going to take all these glosses and make a legal code. And so there's this idea of expansion of the law and contraction of the law, because, right, you need to figure out how to do it, but then other communities do it in different ways. And so And one of the things I love about this is that, there's the multivocality of Judaism, that there is no one way to do something. And Maimonides wrote down 13 principles of faith. He was the first one to do this, and this was radical, because like people were saying, "How dare you tell me what to believe as a Jew?" Right? And his principles were pretty broad, and we can and it's not like people disagree with his principles, the things that he wrote down, but people disagreed with the fact that he wrote down the principles because it's an evolutionary process. And then we have what are called responsa, she'elot, which is, modern, rabbis being asked questions, and rabbis then looking back to all the legal codes and to the Talmud to say, okay, how does all this stuff, apply in modern times? Like, what does Judaism say about electricity, right? That was nothing that was ever written in the code. So how do we figure that out, right? What does Judaism say about, about how we incorporate women into liturgical things? Well, Christian didn't say anything about that, but we've evolved as a society. So this is where modern rabbis in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and now 21st century are writing. They're writing responsa based on questions that people ask, how do I do this thing? I'm going to pause there. Any other questions?
Okay.
Yeah,
I got one.
Sure.
So building off of what you were just saying, so are we still adding to the Talmud? Is there like a Talmud 2022 version? You know what I mean? Because like you said, like the internet didn't exist. So how does it, because it sounds to me like that's really where the Talmud came from, was hey, now that we're in diaspora, we can't live the way that we did in biblical times. So we have to adjust our way of thinking and reevaluate these things. So here in this time right now, we're not doing any animal sacrifices kind of thing. So
right.
Is there like a Talmud 2022 kind of thing?
I'm going to give you a Jewish answer, yes and no. No in the sense that these books are closed, right? These books have their, we're of a time, but what we are doing is continuing the ongoing process of Torah, right? And we're continuing the ongoing process of applying Jewish literature to our, ever evolving lives. And so while we're not going to call it Talmud, because Talmud is one fixed specific thing, we could say, I'm writing a new midrash about, this, or we're coming up with new halakha because of the new circumstances, the new process of doing the new Jewish legal tradition, the ongoing legal tradition. So yes, it's a continually evolving tradition. But I wouldn't call it a new Talmud per se, because the Talmud is a very specific thing in its time. But yes, Jewish tradition is continually evolving and expanding with and look, right now in our moment, there are more Jews than ever before learning and studying Jewish texts, with the amount of Jews in Israel learning and studying texts, the amount of Jews in America learning and studying Jewish texts. This is the most prolific and expansive time of Jewish learning and composition, I would say, ever. I would say, I think there's another hand. Somebody raised their hand. No. Okay. So yeah, that's mostly what I wanted to cover. We are all rabbinic Jews. We are all rabbinite Jews. That we are all living in the traditions of the rabbis, whether we observe that or reject it. Right? At least we're responding to rabbinic Judaism. So that might be changing in the modern era. Because Judaism is undergoing, significant changes. One of the things I wanted to mention, and we'll get into this more, if not next week, then certainly the week after. I mentioned the word, the name Israel. The word Israel, I mentioned the name Jew. So Israel comes from Jacob, who's renamed Israel. Jew or Judahite comes from the tribe of Judah and also the practice. But the word Judaism. So if the word Israel is 3,000 years old, and the word Judaism is the word Jew or Judahite is 2,500 years old, the word Judaism is 300 years old. It's like really, really recent. So we all use the word Judaism, but the word Judaism, and we didn't make it up. Somebody else made it up. And we'll get into this again, maybe next week or the week after. But when Jews were allowed to come out of the ghettos in the modern period and enter the when Jews were allowed to come out of the ghettos and enter the modern period, they and enter society. This was specifically in Europe. They were allowed to be part of society and general culture, but not as a separate people, the Jews. They could do it as someone who practices Judaism, or a German of the Mosaic faith, a Frenchman of the Mosaic faith. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But the word Judaism was coined as a noun form of this is what the Jews do. So it's originally German, Judentum. This is what the Jews do. And we've certainly taken that term upon ourselves, but it's interesting that like the word for the things that Jews do is not a self-referential word that, or a self-invented word that we made up. It's a word that somebody else made up to talk about us. Very interesting. So the word Judaism, again, we all use it, it's fine, but it was made up by somebody else to say, that's the thing that the Jews do, is Judaism. Jews never called themselves Jews. Jews never did Judaism. Jews just lived a Jewish life. They just lived their lives, right? It took somebody else to say, "Hey, you're doing Judaism." It's like, okay, well, we'll call it that too, but like that's just who we are, right? So it's just Jewish practice, and the things that you do as a Jew. That's what other people said. Okay, that's Judaism. So that's a very recent term in the grand scheme of the entire Jewish experience. Okay, if no other questions, that's mostly what I wanted to cover this week. Next week we'll pick up with the rabbinic period, go in through the medieval and into the early modern period, exploring again the arc of the Jewish experience. Any final questions? Okay, great. Well, I will see everyone next Wednesday evening, if not before. Have a good evening, everybody. Bye.